Alright guys, we are starting off this project with a 1999 GMC C6500 top kick. This particular truck is powered by a 7.4 liter Vortec big block gasoline engine and was most recently used as a moving truck with a 26-foot box on the back. The first thing we have to do is get that box removed, and because this is a 26-foot box and we will be putting on a 20-foot shipping container, I can be a little willy-nilly with my plasma cutter here and just start chopping away at this rear end. Now this is the third pizza truck that I've built, all for the same company out in Chicago, so I've got it down to a little bit of a science, although each truck is a little bit different. So I start off by removing the box with the help of my old forklift. This is a 68-year-old forklift that I recently restored. If you'd like to check out that video, I'll put a link to that in the description below, but it's pretty simple. I mount a couple of guides on the front so that the box doesn't fall off the frame rails, and then I use my chain and the forklift to just kind of drag it back. Now these boxes are very popular as storage units, so once I had it removed from the truck, I listed it on Facebook Marketplace and it was sold in 2 days for $1,300. Before I can mount the shipping container, I do have to paint the chassis and the cab, so let's jump right into the bodywork. Once I have everything removed, I start off the paint job by scrubbing down the entire truck with a Scotch-Brite pad just to get all the dirt, grime, and grease off, and then I jump right to my orbital sander with a 220 grit sandpaper, and this is really just to get to a stage where I can find out where all the imperfections are. Now on the passenger side, it's pretty clear that the mirror had impacted something at some point, so all of the little riv nuts were a little bit loose and then the body was a little bit dinged up. I really should not have been welding this without some protection on the glass. I just got lucky. I didn't even notice that until I was editing this. Once I got it all welded up, then I can see every little imperfection that it's got. So I mark it with two different colors. The first color is going to be the areas that I need to use actual body filler on, and then the other color is going to be the very light imperfections that I use my final glaze on. For the body filler on these commercial jobs, I use Evercoat's Lightweight series. I think it's about twice as good as Bondo and about half as good as Evercoat's Rage series, but it is a lot less expensive. The only real complaint that I have on it is that it does generate a lot of pinholes, but we take care of that later with the glaze coat. Now for the glaze coat, I use Dolphin Glaze, and I have nothing but positive things to say about it. It does a great job of filling in all the pinholes, it dries really fast, and it's really easy to sand. The last thing I have to do before I can actually lay down the paint is give it one last wet sand with 400 grit sandpaper. Then I start off by painting the chassis. The paint I'm using here is called Hot Rod Black by Speedo Coat. It is one of my all-time favorite paints. It does a tremendous job of covering everything from raw steel to slightly rusty steel. As long as it's clean, it seems to bond to it no problems. So I get everything coated with this nice little satin black. I even lay a coat on top of the body filler that I've got on the doors to act as a bit of a primer, and then I paint the door handles with it as well. For the top coat, I'm going with a jet black gloss, again from Speedo Coat, and I'm shooting it through my Devil Biss GPG paint gun with a 1.4mm tip on it. Black is a notoriously difficult color to paint. It shows every imperfection that you've got, and it's really easy to miss a spot. So after I lay down the first coat, I use a bright light to try to track down any spots I've missed or imperfections, and then I lay down the second coat and use that same light again. And you can really see that difference on the passenger side between the first and the second coat. Now this is very clearly a commercial paint job. This is not a show quality paint job. The difference between the two can be thousands of dollars, and it makes absolutely no sense to spend the extra time and money on a vehicle that is going to be used and abused to make it look perfect from closer than, say, 10 feet away. Alright, this is where the project starts to really get fun. We get to actually put the shipping container on the truck. And it starts off as a little bit of a foggy day, but you'll see in a second here, boy, it turned out to be absolutely beautiful. The only problem is that I had to do this all by myself. So once we get Forky McForklift out there and we get it lifted up, I have to go back and forth between the forklift and the truck and the forklift and the truck. And it takes, well, you can see by the clouds, it takes a while. This is where the real work begins, so I go ahead and fire up my cloning machine so that I can get a copy of myself so we can make quick work of this. And I start off by cutting the entire top and the entire bottom because the plan here is to make this entire wall glass. We want as much glass as possible, so I've really got to push it to the edges. Now I can't lift this entire panel by myself, so I go ahead and cut it into 3 sections. And then on the back side of the truck, I hook up a chain along with a come-along so that I can slowly lower it down. Once we've got those panels out of the way, the next step is to get the surface as clean as possible so that I can then weld my inner frame to it. So that means grinding. A lot of grinding. Because this truck is so much taller than a traditional food truck, I have to build a lower section to actually serve the pizzas out of. So that's what I'm doing here. And I'm starting off with 5-inch structural C-channel because it matches the look of the bottom portion of the shipping container. Once I get the frame all welded into place, I can then start on the interior, and I do that by marking out exactly where I want the lower section to be, and then I use an impact driver to get all of the screws out of the subfloor. Now this flooring is a little over 1 inch thick, and it is of course made out of wood, but there is metal underneath it, so I have to be very careful with my saw blade here. So I set it at around 7/8 of an inch, and then I double check it with the grinder, and then I lower it just a little bit more, and I do that 3 times until I eventually get all the way through the wood so I can remove it. Up next is building the new inner frame that will actually hold all of our glass, and for that I start off using 1.5 inch square tubing. So you'll notice I've added a chain and a binder here, and the reason for that is because the steel walked out on me a little bit after I cut out that subframe. It's not a lot, it's about 1/8 of an inch, so what I did was I actually pulled the steel in 1/8 of an inch farther than it needs to be, and the idea is after I weld up the entire subframe, I can then release the tension on that chain and it should go back to where it needs to be. 1/8 of an inch isn't a lot, but the idea is if you aim small, you'll miss small, and it will make my life a lot easier when it comes time to installing the glass and installing and building that door. Over here, I'm framing up a small window that will be directly above our service window and our entry door, so we'll end up with 4 large windows and then a small window. Now that we've got our basic framing done, the next step is to finish up the lowered surface area, so I'm back over to my Evolution saw where I'm cutting up some square tubing for the frame. All of the metal squares you see me use are made by a local company called Fireball Tools. I have no affiliation with them, but I do think they're a fantastic company, so I'll put a link to their website in the description below in case you want to check them out. Next up is some 14 gauge diamond plate so I can box it up. Next up, I've got to make the stairs, and rather than cut a bunch of small pieces and then weld them all together, I decided to use a single sheet of diamond plate and my grinder to grind not quite all the way through it so that I can then take the sheet over to my welding table, bend it all up 90 degrees, weld on some supports, and then head back over to the truck and install it as a single piece. Once I get the stairs all welded into place, I'm then able to release the tension on that chain and then double check everything, and we ended up exactly where we need to be. There is a ton of welding that's required on this box, and unfortunately, I already disposed of my 2 full-size clones, so I had to fire up my clone machine and get one that wasn't quite ready yet. He's a little on the younger side, but luckily he still knows how to weld, so he helps get this job done. Up next is what ends up being one of the most difficult parts of this entire job, and that's the door. And it doesn't seem like a door should be very complicated, but it is the only part that actually moves, and it has to deal with years of commercial abuse without any failures, and you do have to have a service window that folds up, and then you have to have a service table that folds down. So in the end, this door takes about as much time to do as all the other fabrication combined. Now that we've got the basic framing of the door done, the next step is to fill in the lower portion, and for that I'm using an old piece of shipping container that I had from the last pizza truck. I think it gives it a better look than just using flat steel. I want you guys to see if you can figure out what mistake I'm about to make right here. Oh yeah, this thing's gonna need a door handle at some point. I completely forgot to build the box for the door handle and the lock. Up next is the service window, and it's actually more complicated than it seems. It has to be thin enough to fit inside the door, it has to be light enough to be held up with simple lift struts, and it has to be heavy duty enough to actually last. So I use 1/2-inch square tubing, and then I crisscross it with some reinforcements. Here I'm using some 1/2-inch square tubing that I've previously sent through my roller to give it a nice bend, and this does two things. It gives the window a little bit more structural rigidity, and it gives me a good mounting point for the lift struts. Here we have some 20 gauge sheet metal that I'll be using for the face of the window. I mark out exactly where the framing will be on that window and then head back over to the Bailey where I put a very small bend in the sides and the bottom. That will help it seal against the door just a little bit better and make it just a hair stronger. I then head back over to the welding table where I'm using panel bond to secure the frame to the sheet metal. This is the first time I've used panel bond on this type of a window. This was recommended to me by a viewer on my last truck because I usually weld them because I think it makes it a little bit stronger, but it does slightly distort the sheet metal. I used this product when I was repairing the bedside on my aluminum F-150, and I had great results with that, so I figured I'd give it a go. While I'm waiting on that panel bond to cure, I head over to the truck so that I can build some custom fenders into the container, because you'll see these tires have about 1/8 of an inch before they start rubbing. Now luckily there's only about 3 to 4 inches of travel, so I don't need to make a huge cut, just a nice little curve. I'll then add some flat strap to make it look like a fender, and bam, we'll be done. Next up, I head to the rear, where we still have about 3 feet of jagged frame hanging off the end, and I use my grinder to get a nice clean cut about 2 inches away from the shipping container. I will put a flat piece of steel welded on the frame at the end there, along with a Mansfield bar underneath. Now the next step should be painting the shipping container because we're all done with the exterior fabrication, but before I do that I wanted to build our ceiling frame, so I'm using some 2x4s for that. We will be installing ceiling tiles later on, and I can't have them mounted directly to the steel because we are going to have some flush mounted lighting as well. So to mount the 2x4s, I use a combination of construction adhesive on the inside, which is a polyurethane spray and glue, and then I climb onto the top of the shipping container where I then drill holes through the steel, add a little bit of weatherproofing, and then screw them from the top. So all of the 2x4s will be glued and screwed and gives us a good base for our ceiling tiles in the future. Alright, up next is painting the shipping container, and I have to say I am so excited that I made my paint booth big enough to fit this truck in it. That was not my intention when I designed it, it just kind of ended up this way because of the size and the shape of my garage, but it just so happened to be snowing outside, so I would not have been able to paint it outside. Now, if you guys watched the ice cream truck build, you'd remember that I had some issues with this paint gun when I was painting that box because the spray tip that I was using had a little bit too big of a spray pattern. So when I'd spray from different angles, it would cause some dripping. I switched out to a 6-inch tip on this and I couldn't have been happier with it. It came out fantastic. Alright, now we get to install the ceiling tiles. These are 24 by 24 inches and they're very thin steel. I think they're 26 gauge, so I'm able to use a staple gun to mount them to that wood frame that we made. And I do make one mistake here. I thought that the lighting had to go on the second and the fourth row, but I realized that it's actually the first and the third row. So I take a little break here to cut some holes for our flush mounted lights and then mount all of our wiring, and then I can continue back on our second row. For the lowered surface area, I use a spray-on bed liner, and I've used a lot of different DIY bed liners over the years, and the Raptor liner is absolutely my favorite. It does the best job at not leaving streaks. If you're thinking about using it for yourself, the only thing I recommend is buying some extra so that you can do a final coat that's a little bit farther away, maybe 24 to 36 inches, and that does a really good job of making everything more uniform. Alright, up next we're installing our glass, and I definitely could not do this part all by myself, so I enlisted the help of my lovely wife here, and we are starting off with the smallest window directly above our service door, just because it's going to be the easiest. I apply a layer of windshield adhesive on the inside. She then holds up the glass while I apply another layer, and then I install a smaller frame which squishes everything together, making it nice and watertight. The process for these larger panes is a little bit different because they weigh 95 pounds each. So we've got these large suction cups that allow us to lift it onto the mobile scaffolding. This is safety glass. It is tempered and laminated. The tempering gives it a lot more strength, and then the laminate holds it together in the event that it does crack. I use safety glass on all my vehicles, and knock on wood, so far I haven't had any of them break. I'm using an electric Dewalt caulking gun here, and that's because the windshield adhesive I'm using is so much more viscous than an adhesive that you would send through a manual gun. For these suction cup tools, the blue one I've had for many years, and I got that for lifting granite countertops. The orange ones, those are made by Weaver, and I think they're like $30 a piece. I'll put a link to those, the caulking gun, and then any other tools that I use on this project in the description below. If there's anything you're looking for and you don't see, just write in the comments and then I'll try and track it down for you. Now you can't see it in the video, but I am using a 1/4 inch rubber strip on the bottom between the metal frame and the glass. And once the adhesive is fully cured, the window is rigidly in place, but I wanted to make sure that there was absolutely no contact between the glass and the steel during the installation. Up next, I get some help from my kiddos installing our tile floor. These tiles are made by WeatherTech, and I did a full-length video showing the install of my last pizza truck. If you guys are interested in that, I'll put a link in the description below. But basically, the tiles just snap together. It's pretty simple. I will say, these things are surprisingly water resistant. Next up, I have to build a frame that will act as a threshold between the upstairs and the downstairs, and then on the back side, I'm building a custom table with the shelf because you really can't have too much storage on a vehicle like this, and it will give a perfect spot on the front to mount a menu. Here I'm using another tool from Fireball. This is their 3-axis square, and it is a huge time saver on projects like this.
Hey guys, Viny B here. If you're looking to get a welding fixture table just like Austin, don't do that. That would be dumb. Because I designed and built one that cost half as much and frankly is twice as good. You notice his has 4 inches between holes, but mine are 2. And in this case, a smaller is better. I made an entire video where you can check out that table being built. Link in the description. But if you like to jump right into buying the plans and the extra files, there's also a link to my website down below.
Alright, now is the moment of truth. Here's our first test fitting, and everything works. Fantastic. Alright, so the next step is to give it a handrail, and they do make end caps for this steel, but I would have to go all the way to the steel shop to pick those up. So what I'm doing instead is pie cutting the ends so that I can then hammer them down and then seal it up with a weld, and then all I have to do is sand it, and bam, made myself some nice little metal end caps. This is how it looks all mocked up on the truck. I think it came out pretty nice. The next step is to get it back over to the welding table so that I can finish up the welds and then make a top and a shelf for it and get it ready for paint. I'm making the top and the shelf out of 18 gauge steel, and sadly that is just a little bit too thick for my Bailey to shear, so I have to use the grinder to get it all cut. Once again, the paint that I'm using is Hot Rod Black by Speedo Coat, and it has no problems at all bonding directly to metal as long as it's clean. This is 20 gauge aluminum that will act as the back for our shelf, and I'm installing it with rivets, and until I actually put the rivets in, I use Cleco fasteners to hold it in place. Because this truck is uninsulated and pretty soon it's going to have a 700-degree wood-fired oven in the back, ventilation is very important. So right now I am installing a variable speed fan that on the highest setting can evacuate all of the air out of the truck every 20 seconds. Here I'm building a folding table for the door so that when the service window goes up, this table goes down, and it's where they can actually hand the customer their pizza. Alright, so we're going to switch gears a little bit here. While I'm waiting for deliveries on some of the equipment in the back, I decided to do all of the mechanical work on the front. Now, you guys saw this truck running and driving. It didn't have any major issues, but just like every other box truck I've worked on, it has lots of minor issues. Mainly, we've got really bad leaks out of both valve covers, both exhaust manifolds. The exhaust manifolds have broken studs on both sides, and then we have a pretty bad leak out of our radiator. Lastly, we have what I think is a leaky injector, and I think that because I plugged my computer in and I saw that Bank 1's long-term fuel trim was compensating for an overly rich condition, and usually that's because one of the injectors is stuck open. And once I removed the intake manifold, it was super obvious that the number 7 injector was in fact leaking. Once I made it this far, I went ahead and did a compression check on all 8 cylinders, and luckily they were all within 5% of each other, so we're good to go there. Now we're on to the exhaust manifolds, and these things are always a pain on these old big blocks. I had 4 broken studs. Luckily, I didn't break any more during disassembly, and of those 4, 3 of them were pretty easy to remove, and one of them just gave me all kinds of headache. I ended up making a short on it. I'll put a link to that in the description below. Up next is replacing the bad injector, and normally I replace all of the injectors at the same time because once you're already in here it's a lot easier as far as labor goes, but the cost of injectors has gone up a lot recently and this truck does not have an unlimited budget, so in this case I only replaced the one that was bad. Here I'm replacing the gaskets on both valve covers and then the upper intake manifold, and I'm a big fan of Felpro gaskets, so that's what I'm using. Here are the new exhaust manifold studs, and these are a different design than the ones that I removed. They have larger nuts that are made out of brass, and the idea is the brass is softer obviously than steel, so that as the exhaust manifold gets hot and cold and hot and cold and there's all that thermal expansion and contraction, these brass nuts will allow it to flex enough so that these studs don't break off anymore. And that's it for the mechanical. Hopefully she's good to go for another 125,000 miles. If you thought that I was annoyed by the exhaust manifold studs, that is nothing compared to the pain that is coming up on this fiberglass front end. I waited so long to do this repair because I was really desperate to source a new one that was inexpensive enough to justify, or find somebody that could do this repair so that I wouldn't have to. Unfortunately, that did not happen. I was working with a relatively tight budget for this, and a new front end was going to cost $3,000, and I couldn't even find anybody that was willing to give me an estimate for just the repair. So what I decided to do was allocate 4 days to making this front end as nice as possible, and that's going to keep me from going overboard on cost or time. Here I'm using just a simple metal flat strap to hold the passenger side fender in the correct position, and then I built this little wooden contraption to hold everything together while I fiberglassed the underside. Here's that same urethane glue that I used on the ceiling frame to hold this little piece of the headlight area that was missing, and then I actually use it as a filler on the bottom portion where I was missing the fiberglass entirely. And then there were tons of cracks on this grill, so I'm using the panel bond to actually fill in all of the cracks to hold everything together. So here we are nearing the end of day 1, and my goal was to get the first round of fiberglass done so that it can cure overnight. It's now the beginning of day 2. Everything came out great on the underside. The next step is to flip this up so that I can start to clean up the top. It is now nighttime on day 2, and I am still working because I am very far behind. My goal for the day was to have all of the fiberglass done and sanded so that I could then do my first round of fiberglass filler. Unfortunately, it took a lot longer to cure than I was expecting, so it made for a late night. But I was able to get the first round of fiberglass filler onto this front end. Alright, so it's now the beginning of day 3, and I'll tell you right now, this is my goal going into the day. I want to get everything sanded down and then primered so that I can then find the last few imperfections that I'm sure that I missed. Then I can fill those imperfections in, give it one more primer, and then it is ready to go for only black paint on the last day. Now, what do you think my odds are of actually getting that done in one day? Now I should mention, I would normally have this over in my paint booth. Unfortunately, it was raining and I didn't want to pull the truck out, especially with no front end, but the rain does give up a little bit later in the day, so I am able to get it moved over. Now I want you guys to see just how many different colors we've got on this front fender, and that is the reason that I do 2 separate sessions of primer. I'm not a good enough body guy to be able to get this thing perfect on my first go around, so what I'll do is I'll get it to where it's like 95% good enough, I'll do my first coat of primer, and then clear as day I can see every imperfection that I missed. I can then sand it down and go over it with that same Evercoat lightweight body filler, and then the same Dolphin glaze that I used on the body, fill in all the imperfections, do a second coat of primer, and then it's ready for paint. The really good body guys I know can completely skip this step and get it perfect on their first go around, but bodywork is not the only thing I do, so I'm not the best at it. It is now the beginning of day 4, and I was hoping to have painted this second coat of primer last night, but obviously that did not happen. It's not the end of the world. I think I can still get it done today. All I have to do is shoot the primer, wait for it to cure, and then I can paint the black. So the black paint went on great. Unfortunately, I did rush this job just a little bit because of the time constraints, and in doing so, both coats ended up a little bit on the thin side, so I did have some orange peel. It's about the same as it had when it was white before, and it's about the same as any other box truck you see out there, but I was hoping for a little bit better. So the front emblem was missing the G, and unfortunately, Chevy doesn't make this emblem anymore, and most of the box trucks out there have an emblem that's in way worse shape than mine. But it turns out the new GMCs have the same size logo, it's just all smushed together. So what I did was I bought a used new one, I cut the G off, and then I used panel bond to fix the old one. The last few items we've got that are still unpainted are our wheels and then a new bumper for the front. So I go ahead and throw those into the paint booth and give them a quick paint job. Nothing fancy here, just a silver metallic urethane single stage paint that kind of matches our ceiling tiles. Alright, our shipments are finally starting to arrive. The first thing we get is our pizza prep station. This is the table where you actually make the pizzas. It has a lowered refrigerated section for all the toppings. This was not designed for a mobile application. This was designed for a regular brick and mortar store. So it does have wheels on the bottom. They have little locks, but obviously that's not enough for something that will be on the road. So I do have to remove those wheels and then replace them with some legs that I can bolt to the floor. While I was building the custom legs for this table, we did go ahead and get our sink in. Unfortunately, the wiring ran out the back and I needed it out the side, so I went ahead and used a hole punch to knock a hole in the side so I could run our electricity that way. The electricity on this is very simple. It's basically wired up like an RV. What I'm working on here is one of my favorite parts of this whole build. I'm a huge fan of low-tech solutions, and that's exactly what this is. We have a stainless steel table flipped upside down, and then the brackets for the legs have been cut off. Now they're a little bit on the ugly side, and they will be visible under certain circumstances, so what I'm doing now is taking a sheet and I'm making some plates to cover up those ugly grind marks. Next, I rivet the aluminum plates into the stainless steel, and if you're wondering what that bracket is at the top, don't worry, this will all make sense in a minute. Next up, I'm installing some hinges on the back, that way this table can fold down from the wall. And this is where that bracket comes into play. I built a corresponding bracket on the prep table so that it can fold down, and on one side it rests on that bracket, and on the other side it rests on the sink. We are continuing our super low-tech solution here with the latch. We have a shoulder bolt with one moving part because this latch has to deal with not only years of commercial abuse, but also Chicago's roads. So the more simple I can make it, the longer it will last. After I finish putting together the sink, I then fill it up with water and test it. This sink is made by Cooler Depot and it's basically made out of RV parts. Next up, we've got a table that is going next to our pizza oven, and just like the other products I've been working on, it was designed for a brick and mortar store, not something that would be moving, so I do need to make some brackets to bolt it down to the floor. And those brackets that I'm welding were made out of the parts that I removed from the table that's now on the wall. Here I'm installing a riv nut into our window frame so that I can then add a rubber isolator and then mount this table not only to the floor but also to the wall. So I told you guys the wiring on the truck is basically set up like an RV. Well, right now it's running on shore power, where I'm running everything off of a 110 outlet in my garage. This generator will allow me to run it standalone. So I have to build a custom bracket for it. Nothing fancy here, I'm just using some angle iron. I removed the wheels and the little dolly off of the generator so that I can bolt it directly to this. The engine inside does have isolators, so I can mount the frame nice and solid to it. It has finally arrived, our super fancy $16,000 wood-fired pizza oven. This particular oven is made by Fiero Forni, and it weighs 2,800 pounds. Now I want you guys to notice something here. All of the factory plastic on this is still in place, and everything looks like it's in perfect condition. I saw absolutely no damage when I was signing for this. Keep that in mind. Now because these ovens are so heavy, they ship with the table on top. So you have to remove the table and then you can put the oven on top of it afterwards. And I saw absolutely no damage to this oven until right here. So you see me taking pictures, getting on the phone with the owner, and this is what it looked like. Now your guess is as good as mine for how this could have happened. Something had to sneak through that wooden frame without stretching or cutting the plastic that it was wrapped in and bend this front fascia out of place. Makes absolutely no sense to me. So I get on the phone with Fiero Forni and they say I can cut the rivets, remove the front fascia, and they can send me out a new one. But my expectation is if they send me one, it's going to be 2 weeks late and it's going to be the wrong color. So I decide to throw it on my welding table and see if I can fix it. Best case scenario, they get me a new one in a couple of days. Worst case scenario, I throw this one on and then the new one can be a spare later on. Once again, we have to take something that was made for a brick and mortar store like this table and convert it to something that will work in our food truck. So I do that by cutting all the paint off of the bottom of the table legs so that I can then weld some 3/16 plate steel to the bottom so we can bolt this thing down. Next up, I have to build a storage area for wood while this truck is in service, and I start off by using some expanded steel. This large piece is really just to keep anything that's stored under the oven from making contact with the glass, so I still have to bend another sheet so that I can have a smaller area just for wood storage. Obviously, I still haven't received that front fascia, but that's okay. I can still mount the oven on top of the table. Now, the way this is designed, it's like a 2.5-inch square tubing that slides over a 2-inch square tubing. So I go ahead and grind the paint so that I can get a weld on all 4 of the corners, but that's not the only thing I'm going to rely on. I am going to drill a 1/2-inch hole through and send some grade 8 bolts to keep everything nice and tight. Now this frame is triangulated on both the sides, but not on the front or the back. So I go ahead and add a diagonal bar to give a little bit of strength and rigidity. I was told this oven had a vertical exhaust vent, and it arrived with a 45-degree vent. But luckily, I can cut it at 22.5 degrees, flip it around 180 degrees, and just like that, we've got ourselves a vertical stack. Now comes the fun part. We get to use our 68-year-old forklift to get this 2,800-pound pizza oven in the back. And if you guys saw my last pizza truck video, I used the same forklift, but that was before the restoration. So I still had the traditional drive setup on it before. Now it's hydraulically driven. That made all the difference. It was so much easier to install this time. Absolutely love this little Forky McForklift. Because this oven is so heavy, I made sure that the plates went through the actual metal beams that go across the shipping container and not just into the wood. Now we get to install the chimney. Even though this chimney is dual wall and insulated, I'm still using a high temperature caulk around the seal. Surprise, surprise, the front fascia never arrived, so I went ahead and reinstalled the old one, and truth be told, I think I did a fantastic job on this repair. I don't think you can see the damage until you're a foot or two away, and you certainly can't see it from the outside, so it didn't make a huge difference in the end, and Fierro was able to eventually send a new fascia to Bricks out in Chicago. Now this oven was designed with a sheet of aluminum sitting directly on top of the fiberglass, and that might work in a brick and mortar store, but that doesn't work for a truck that's bouncing down the road. So we came up with this design to add a framework under the aluminum, rivet the aluminum to that framework, and then seal all of the gaps. I also redid the seal around the chimney because the cutting on the old one was atrocious, and then once I installed that, I covered every single gap and crack that we had with a high temperature metal tape. It was a tremendous amount of work, but at least this way we won't have any fiberglass floating around this truck while it's driving down the road. And lastly, I installed a drip rail on the entire length of the shipping container because otherwise we'd have a ton of water streaks down this glass. Alright guys, so just a reminder, this is what our truck looked like before, and this is what it looks like now. Let's take a look inside. So here's the service window from the inside. Got our little lock right here. Let's get this opened up. And this is what it looks like from the outside. Now take your pizza and get out of here. Over here, we have a GFCI outlet along with a USB-A and a USB-C port. We have our light switch right here. Up the stairs, we've got our stainless steel table along with the prep table here. We've got some storage underneath here. We've got our extra working surface right here, along with that cool guy latch that I'm super proud of. We've got our 4-bay sink. In this corner, there's going to be a vintage Pepsi machine. We just don't have that. That's waiting for Bricks in Chicago. Over here, we've got our fancy wood-fired oven. This is probably the cleanest this inside is ever going to be. Over here, we've got our little ventilation fan. I did add an extra electrical port right here in case they want to add a vented fan for the oven at a later point. And back here, we left just enough room for a fridge. Again, that's waiting for Bricks in Chicago. Overall, it's a pretty simple design. So the last pizza truck that I built, I ended up having to rebuild the engine with the help of my daughter. And because we rebuilt the engine, I wanted to make sure that I put the first 2,000 miles on it so that I could do a proper engine break-in procedure. So I drove the truck the entire way to Chicago. It was not fun. Luckily, I didn't have to do too much engine work on this truck, so we are going to deliver to Chicago on a lowboy. Unfortunately, what that means is I'm not going to get the first pizza out of this oven, which is a huge bummer. So if you're in the greater Chicago area, you can actually try pizza off this truck before I get a chance to. I'll put a link in the description below where you can find out exactly where this truck is going to be or how you can rent it if you want it for your next event. So that's it for this video. Thanks for making it all the way through. I'll see you guys later.
Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye-bye.